Howdy, friends. You're listening to How the West Was Cast, a podcast dedicated to the best of the Western movie genre.
Is that the John Wayne you know?
No
you made
comment.
a movie
No,
about?
as a matter of fact, I don't want to get involved in a conversation on John Wayne. Of course,
well,
I tell you, I've made quite...
You're closer to his size than I am, so get in here.
No, I've made quite a few pictures with John Wayne. And by the way, I've always called him John. Everybody calls him Duke.
Yeah.
We have never seen eye to eye on a lot of things. But professionally,
Yeah.
I think he's one of the most professional actors I've ever worked with.
Oh, yeah, he is.
That was Kirk Douglas speaking with Dick Cavett in 1971 about working with John Wayne. And on this special episode of How the West Was Cast, we'll be discussing some of our favorite Kirk Douglas Westerns and what they mean to us. Hello, my name is Matthew Chernov, and I'm a screenwriter and an entertainment journalist in Los Angeles.
And I'm Andrew Patrick Nelson, a film historian and the chair of the Department of Film and Media Arts at the University of Utah.
Now for this episode, we've each chosen 3 Kirk Douglas Westerns that we think are well worth recommending. These films are available on a variety of streaming platforms like Amazon and YouTube, so if you haven't seen them yet and they sound interesting to you, by all means, check them out and let us know what you think. Okay then, Andrew, why don't you introduce the subject of today's show?
When Kirk Douglas passed away on February 5th of this year, at the age of 103, cinema lost one of its greatest performers. The star of Champion, Ace in the Hole, The Bad and the Beautiful, Lust for Life, Paths of Glory, Spartacus, and some 70 other films, Douglas was the last surviving male A-list star of Hollywood's golden age, a man who made a career of defying time and cheating death, both on screen and off. They say that movie stars live forever on screen. With Douglas, it seemed like he'd just live forever, period. Born Isyur Danilovich, the youngest of 7 children and only son of Russian Jewish immigrants, Douglas grew up poor in Amsterdam, New York in the teens and 20s. But the ragman's son, as he titled his 1988 autobiography, overcame both poverty and prejudice, first earning a wrestling scholarship to St. Lawrence University, and then a scholarship to attend the prestigious American Academy of Dramatic Arts in New York City. Douglas served in the Navy in World War II and then resumed his acting career, landing a number of roles on Broadway. On the recommendation of Lauren Bacall, a former classmate at the Academy of Dramatic Arts, producer Hal Wallace cast Douglas opposite Barbara Stanwyck in The Strange Love of Martha Ivors in 1946, launching the actor's movie career. With his athletic build, sweeping blonde hair, steel blue eyes, pearl white teeth, and dimpled chin, Douglas cut a dashing figure. Yet his acting style, most especially his guttural voice, always hinted at a simmering rage just beneath the surface, barely contained, ever threatening to boil over and consume him, along with whoever else happened to be close by. To watch Douglas on screen is to experience a continual pull and push of attraction and repulsion. If Douglas, as many critics observed, exuded masculine energy on screen, that energy surely carried with it all the complexities and contradictions of what it meant to be a man in post-war America. As the actor himself said, "I've made a career of playing sons of bitches." Douglas excelled in tough guy roles, in gangster pictures, war movies, and westerns. He liked making westerns. "No actor I know would turn down a good role in a western," Douglas once said. "They may claim they want to do one as a change of pace, or a chance to show their versatility. The truth is that they are just as much drawn to the gun-toting hero as the child who wants his first present to be a hog leg and holster and cowboy hat." Between 1952 and 1984, Douglas starred in 16 westerns, beginning with the long-forgotten timber drama The Big Trees, which he made for free to get out of his contract with Warner Brothers, and concluding with Draw, a television movie about an aging outlaw up against his old nemesis, an alcoholic lawman played by James Coburn. In between these 2 films, Douglas made many good westerns, Gunfight at the OK Corral with frequent co-star Burt Lancaster being his biggest western hit. But in general, we don't think of Douglas as a western star. And with the exception of Lonely Are the Brave, Douglas's western performances are seldom counted among his greatest, even by Douglas himself. Looking at Douglas's western filmography, we see many great films, but no exceptional ones. whether exceptional in quality, as judged by critics at the time or since, or exceptional for the influence they had on the genre. Instead, nearly all of his Western movies are attempts to follow in the footsteps of an earlier groundbreaking work. The Indian Fighter is one of many films about white heroes among Indians that followed Broken Arrow, only with a happy ending. Man Without a Star, about a wandering hero who finds himself in the middle of a range war, is a variation on Shane. Gunfight at the OK Corral tells one of the Western's most famous stories and was directed by a man, John Sturges, who attempted to undo much of the film in a subsequent telling, 1967's Hour of the Gun. Last Train from Gun Hill borrows High Noon's scenario of a lone hero facing a gang of villains, an antagonistically apathetic town, and a ticking clock. The Last Sunset is one of many dark westerns about psychologically scarred antiheroes that followed the release of The Searchers. The War Wagon is about a group of professionals in the mode of Rio Bravo, and The Way West is one of many wagon train westerns that came after the Cinerama epic How the West Was Won. The conventionality of Douglas's westerns, especially when compared to the novelty of many of his more famous roles, may account for some of their neglect. But if Douglas didn't blaze new trails in the western, he always brought something new to otherwise familiar terrain. He is, after all, a very different actor than Jimmy Stewart, Gary Cooper, Alan Ladd, or John Wayne. Watching new variations of familiar stories, stories we enjoy, is one of the pleasures of not just the Western, but all movie genres. So if you wanted to know what Broken Arrow would have been like if it ended with the hero frolicking naked in a river with his Indian wife, well, Kirk Douglas is your man.
So let's jump right into it. Andrew, what's the first film on your list?
For my picks, I decided to spread things out a little bit and go with one movie from the 1950s, one from the 60s, and one from the 70s. This first selection was by far the most challenging. Douglas made 6 westerns in the 50s, and with the exception of The Big Trees, there is a lot to like in all of them. In the end, though, I went with Last Train from Gun Hill from 1959. The film reteamed Douglas with most of the key personnel from Gunfight at the OK Corral, including director John Sturges, producer Hal Wallace, and cinematographer Charles Lang. James Poe wrote the screenplay based on a story by longtime Gunsmoke writer Les Crutchfield. Douglas plays Matt Morgan, a U.S. Marshal determined to apprehend the 2 men who raped and murdered his Indian wife. He tracks them to the neighboring town of Gun Hill and learns that one, Rick, is the only son of an old friend, the cattle baron Craig Belden, played by Anthony Quinn. Last Train from Gun Hill is, on one level, an obvious combination of High Noon and 3:10 to Yuma. Morgan finds himself up against not only Belden and his men, but also the cowardly citizens of Gun Hill who refuse to help the embattled lawman for fear of offending the despotic Belden. The movie's final act follows Morgan as he struggles determinedly to get Rick on board the 3:10 train to Yuma, the last train to Gun Hill. But what might have been a derivative genre exercise is elevated in nearly every respect. As he almost always did in his westerns, director Sturges emphasizes both the similarities and differences between his male leads, ringing them maximally for tension and conflict. Lang's consistent low-angle cinematography renders exteriors expansive and interiors claustrophobic. And then at the center of the film, Douglas delivers perhaps his most restrained Western performance. I love the degrees of incredulity Morgan passes through over the course of the film, his disbelief at the deepening immorality and perversion he's forced to confront. Douglas is, to my mind, wholly believable and wholly sympathetic in Last Train from Gun Hill, which is not always the case in his westerns.
Yeah, I think it's such a great movie. It's a great looking movie, shot in VistaVision with that Technicolor. It really pops off the screen. What you're talking about with Kirk's performance, he really is more restrained, especially after watching so many of his films recently in prep for this. He's coiled tight here. Mm-hmm. He's pretty loose at first. He has that wonderful intro with those kids who are begging him to tell the story of a classic gunfight, and he's so animated. It looks like he just jumped right out of 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, and that kind of go for broke gusto. But later on, after the rape and murder of his wife, he is like an ice man, and it shows in his performance.
Yeah, the film does a really interesting thing about distinguishing the past from the present. And when the kids are asking him to tell those stories, they're asking him to tell stories from the past, these old exciting days of so many years ago. And in his performance there at the start, you get the sense that he's comfortable knowing that those days are behind. And then when this kind of violent past intrudes upon his present, that's when I guess I find these various shades of disbelief that he goes through. There are certain moments where he kind of comes out. My favorite line is probably when he finally brings Rick into the hotel, and the hotel proprietor is telling him, you can't do this. This is against the law. And he says, I am the law. Foreshadowing Judge Dredd.
Yeah, that's perfect. The murder scene, it takes place off screen somewhat, but we hear her repeated screams as the camera sort of pulls away. And I kept thinking we were going to go off on a really easy one scream and as the symbol of the entire attack. But she pauses and then screams again, and there's another pause, and she screams even worse. So it kind of subliminally has this explicit quality in your head that makes you do all of this terrible work. And I was impressed by that.
Well, and for 1959, you see about as much female nudity as you could. And also the juxtaposition of the violent act against the pastoral setting is also very, very upsetting, because it takes place out in nature where we don't expect that kind of scene to take place in a film. Very disturbing.
It reminded me of an Elmore Leonard story, in that kind of super tight, very clear characters. And I mean that as a huge compliment. Elmore Leonard is just such a brilliant writer. And this film, I think, has that same feel to it.
Even the protagonist, the kind of the no-nonsense man with a dark past who's going to repress things and has found a way, unlike a lot of heroes in the 1950s, to actually kind of harness that repressed energy and not let it overtake him in the way that so many of Douglas's film heroes do.
We also get a cameo from one of my favorite monster actors, Glenn Strange. He's the, I guess, the brothel bouncer or something, and he gets killed by Douglas at a certain point. And I love Glenn Strange. In fact, last weekend I literally visited his grave in Hollywood. He made such a wonderful Frankenstein. I mean, he didn't have as much heart maybe as Karloff's monster, but he was such a huge hulking presence. It's just a throwaway role here, but it's always fun to see those classic actors pop up 10 years after you'd expect them to.
That's one of the wonderful things about the Western, is you get these people who pop up because they were on the lot.
The producer and director of Gunfight at the OK Corral give the screen an even greater drama of raw, gripping, ever-mounting suspense and excitement. Kirk Douglas as Matt, who had every gun in Gun Hill aimed at him.
Just keep away from those guns.
Anthony Quinn as Craig, the king of Gun Hill, fighting to save his son from the man who wanted to hang him.
Now, I got 20 men down here. Now, you turn Rick loose.
You know the answer to that.
This is your last chance.
The clock ticking away their lives like a bomb as the train whistle wails a warning that death is roaring into Gun Hill right on time.
Okay, Matt, so that's my first film. What is your first Kirk Douglas Western?
My first Kirk Douglas film is The Way West, made in 1967 and directed by Andrew V. McLaughlin. It's based on a novel by A.B. Guthrie that won a Pulitzer Prize for fiction in 1950. The film also stars Robert Mitchum and Richard Widmark. It's a wagon train film about a tough U.S. senator, played by Douglas, who leads a group of settlers overland from Missouri to Oregon in 1843. Mitchum plays a hired gun who helps protect everyone from various threats, and Widmark plays a high-spirited farmer who clashes with Douglas as the journey continues. Now, The Way West isn't exactly a well-loved movie. You probably won't find it on the list of a lot of greatest westerns ever made. And considering it was made in 1967, it feels like a movie made 10 years earlier in a lot of ways. But there are still plenty of things I love about this movie. First and foremost is British-born American director Andrew V. McLaughlin, who's one of my favorite filmmakers. He's best known for action movies and westerns, and he learned the ropes as an assistant director alongside John Ford. McLaughlin specialized in movies about tough men struggling under great pressure, and The Way West certainly qualifies. And simply in terms of livestock management, this film is pretty impressive. I mean, there are a lot of animals on screen at any given moment in this movie. We see dozens of covered wagons being pulled by both horses and cattle. They end up crossing rivers and traversing mountains, and at the end being lowered over cliffs by ropes. It's quite an amazing sight. You've also got a great character actor, Jack Elam, showing up briefly as a stowaway preacher who's discovered halfway along the trip. Elam, of course, is so wonderful as the hired killer in Once Upon a Time in the West, and, of course, as the demented proctologist who tags along with Burt Reynolds in the Cannonball Run. His presence alone in any movie makes it worth watching. Then you've also got 21-year-old Sally Field in her first feature role, playing a character who's basically the personification of every dirty farmer's daughter joke ever written. Her subplot feels a little pervy at times, but you can't say it's not memorable. Also worth mentioning is Albert Whitlock's special effects, which are really incredible. Whitlock provides more than half a dozen stunning images where we see the wagon train navigating landscapes that would have been impossible to visualize any other way. Now, if you notice that I haven't mentioned Kirk Douglas, it's because I feel like he's a little bit miscast in this film. I know he's played heavies a lot, but something about him, that's just not how I usually picture Douglas. I feel like maybe if he had traded roles with Richard Widmark, it might have worked out a little bit better. But the idea for this episode was to choose our favorite Kirk Douglas Westerns, not necessarily the ones that Kirk Douglas is best in. So in that respect, The Way West fits the bill for me.
Yeah, certainly not a classic of the genre, and I would echo your comment that the film feels a lot older, and this will be the case with one of the films that I'm going to talk about a little bit later. Just goes to show that simply because time marches on, it doesn't mean that genres march along with it, and film history is marked by not only moments of progress, but also some regression, and we would certainly see that in this film, probably most prominently with its depiction of Native Americans, which seems like a real step back from some of the advances we saw in the 1950s. I appreciate the shout out to Andrew V. McLaughlin. I'm also a really big fan of his. He's certainly carved out a niche for himself in handling, let's say, maturing male stars beginning in the 1960s and carrying on really into the early 1980s. He really had a knack for that. And his place in the history of the genre really hasn't been written. Along with Burt Kennedy, he's one of the most prolific Western filmmakers of the 1960s and 70s. He just cranked them out, and some of the films are really quite good. I have a question for you about this film. Probably the most controversial or notorious scene involves Kirk Douglas's character, Senator Tadlock, who in the film, spoiler alert, has a son along with him. He's a widower, and then his son dies. And then after his son passes away and they bury him, Tadlock instructs his slave to whip him as punishment for the death of his son. And this is a scene that I never have a great read on. What do you make of that scene, having probably watched the film more times than I have?
It's always been a baffling scene to me. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's obviously now it's fairly disturbing material when it comes up. I'm sure it was meant to be. So I don't think we're supposed to not be disturbed by it.
I don't know. I mean, the scene is completely unnecessary, too. It doesn't do anything to advance the story. There's no subtext where this is a thing that Douglas's character does, the kind of self-flagellation. It could have been. So it just kind of hangs there as this really sour note in what is already a very uneven film. And to have it never referenced again and to kind of be redeemed in the end, it's very, very odd to me. But as you said, this is in some ways an uneven film.
Well, I have to say, here in Los Angeles at Quentin Tarantino's movie theater, the New Beverly Cinema that he owns and programs, about a couple of years ago, he programmed a month-long 35-millimeter tribute to McLaughlin. And that was just glorious to see some of those films brought out. It's probably the first time a lot of them had been shown in 35 in years. So it was really, L.A. was the place to be that month.
Hitch up those wagons. We still got 3 hours of daylight, and the Oregon Liberty train keeps moving.
And nothing in hell could stop them. On the 16th of April, 1843, the sun rose in the east and raced the first Oregon Liberty train across the untracked land, emblazoning across the sky the names of the men and the women who took away west.
We're here first, and we're crossing first.
You're wrong, mister. You think you're crossing first.
My second pick today is The War Wagon from 1967. In this film, John Wayne plays Taw Jackson, great handle, a rancher out for revenge against the villainous cattle and mining baron Frank Pierce. Years before, Pierce stole everything from Jackson, including a rich gold deposit on his land, and had Jackson sent to prison. Pierce now transports the gold in his War Wagon, a heavily armored stagecoach. To take back the gold, Jackson hatches a plan for an elaborate heist and enlists a motley crew of professionals, including Kirk Douglas as Lomax, a charismatic gunfighter and safecracker, and also former ally of Pierce. This film was directed by Burt Kennedy, who made a name for himself writing 4 of the celebrated renowned westerns in the 1950s, all directed by Bud Boetticher and starring Randolph Scott. Kennedy went on to become the most prolific Western filmmaker of the 1960s and 70s, only edging Andrew V. McLaughlin because Kennedy made some TV Westerns. Now, The War Wagon is, like The Way West, very much of its time. There's the indebtedness to Rio Bravo I mentioned earlier. There are some cringe-worthy depictions of women and American Indians that indicate, again, that the genre had regressed from some of its achievements of the 1950s. And we also see the emerging influence of Sergio Leone on the American Western, and elements like the armored stagecoach's Gatling gun, as well as the explosion of a bridge. But the main attraction of this film is, as you would expect, the interplay between Douglas and Wayne. Now, to say these men were political opposites would be an understatement. But this only enhances their playful antagonism on screen. They have great chemistry and an easygoing, very macho rapport. Now, while Wayne, by this point in his career, had grown actually quite comfortable in roles that poked fun at his heroic persona, here he mostly plays straight man to Douglas's flamboyant Lomax. Jackson gets the better of Lomax in the end, of course, but there's a greater sense of parody between Wayne and Douglas than between Wayne and, say, Dean Martin or Jimmy Stewart or Robert Mitchum. So that puts Douglas alongside Maureen O'Hara and Angie Dickinson as one of the few people able to stand up to Wayne on screen. Fine company, if you ask me.
Very true, especially after having seen this film now for the first time. That was my confession. I hadn't seen this before you picked it as one of your films, so it was kind of a blank spot for me. And based on the cast and the plot description, I was positive I was going to love it. But after watching it, I'm not sure I get this movie that much. Douglas is particularly hammy here, and his constant mugging is a little hard to take. Also, his weird costumes didn't help too much either. The costumes in this movie are so odd. His yellow scarf and that weird yellow vest thing that he wears, it's such
his giant ring as
yeah.
well.
Yeah, the costumes, they reminded me of like the 60s Batman TV show where everything is a little larger than life. And even Wayne, whose films around this period I really do love, it felt like this Wayne performance is the one that John Wayne impersonators sort of gravitate to and base their material on. There's something about the way he handles himself where every move feels very deliberate and very much like he's kind of giving the audience what they want at that point. And probably the thing that left me the most disappointed was the actual War Wagon itself. When I heard armored stagecoach, I was all over this because I have a real love for weird armored vehicles in movies.
Well, you're a James Bond guy, so that makes sense.
Definitely. James Bond stuff, or Death Race 2000, or the sci-fi movie from the 80s, Battle Truck. Even the TV movie even the TV movie Killdozer has that kind of odd armored vehicle thing. But here the War Wagon felt a little chintzy to me. Like I wanted at least one more gag with it beyond just the little tower and the Gatling gun. So, and I found out while I was looking it up online, the War Wagon still exists, or at least it did up until the late 90s. Somebody had found it at the Universal Studios in Florida theme park.
Really?
Where they have a lot of props from various films. I found a photo of it online from like 1997, and it looked in really good shape. It's just in the park somewhere, or like as decor. So you can maybe still see it there.
You know, I'd have to double check this, but I'm pretty sure the War Wagon is one of many Westerns that Wayne made in Mexico during that time. So if that's true, that War Wagon traveled a long way to get to Universal Studios, Florida.
Yeah, it looked identical. I mean, it was pretty cool. And so I got to say that looked neat. But I did love the goofy bar fight in this film. It's pretty fun. It's Hal Needham got a lot of material off of this film. I think he based his aesthetic on a lot of Burt Kennedy's filmography.
Yeah. No, I take all of those criticisms, and I still really enjoy the Western. I'm a fan of Burt Kennedy. I think, he's in a difficult position because he, wrote some of the greatest scripts in Western movie history, and those have tended to overshadow his career as a director. But with that said, yes, the hamminess is really interesting. And I mean, what you're perhaps suggesting is there's a kind of effeminacy to Kirk Douglas's performance in this film. And maybe I was being a little bit too oblique at the end there, but it's interesting that when it comes to standing up to Wayne, the only people man enough to stand up to Wayne in the movies were either women or Kirk Douglas at his most effeminate.
I've made a lot of Westerns in my time, but never one like the War Wagon. The War Wagon is a story about friendship and understanding.
You're worth 12,000 to me. Dead.
And 100,000 alive.
The War Wagon is a story of happiness.
It offers you a little action.
Generosity. The War Wagon is a story of humility. Now! Mine hit the ground first.
Mine was taller.
So my second Kirk Douglas film is Lonely Are the Brave from 1962, directed by David Miller and written by Dalton Trumbo from a novel by Edward Abbey. Along with Douglas, the film also stars Jenna Rollins, Walter Matthau, George Kennedy, and Carol O'Connor, all of them still quite new to movie screens at the time. Douglas plays Jack Burns, a Korean war vet turned footloose cowboy who can't stomach the way the world is changing around him. When an old friend is sent to jail in New Mexico for helping a group of immigrants find work, Jack breaks into the jail to free his buddy, but ends up breaking out alone when his friend refuses to leave. Now a fugitive on the run, Jack's pursued by a local sheriff, played by Matthau, and eventually winds up in a tragic situation where he and his beloved horse Whiskey encounter a truck full of toilets on a rainy highway at night. Now, as strange as those toilets might sound, The truth is, Lonely Are the Brave is as riveting and powerful as anything written by Cormac McCarthy or Sam Shepard. Douglas delivers an explosive performance here, easily one of his best. It's also an incredibly physical role, especially once the manhunt in the second half begins. There are some nerve-wracking sequences late in this film where Douglas climbs a mountain with his horse in tow that are just unbelievably exciting. It's hard to imagine any actor today, other than maybe Tom Cruise, doing this many treacherous stunts by himself, but Douglas pulls them all off perfectly. The film's opening scene of a sleeping cowboy being woken by 3 jets flying overhead is one of the most poetic images in film history. There are just so many wonderful elements in this movie to talk about. For example, Douglas's relationship with his horse. There's a genuine chemistry between the two of them, so much so that apparently Douglas adopted the horse after production. Then there's Kirk's brutal bar fight against a one-armed man that's just amazing. This fight scene is brilliantly shot and choreographed, and the score by Jerry Goldsmith is superb. When it comes to unforgettable moments, the scene at the beginning where Douglas and his horse get stuck in the middle of a busy highway with cars racing past them on both sides, it's a perfect snapshot of this film's central theme, the collision between 2 ways of life, the old and the new, both squaring off on a dusty road in New Mexico. I also love the way the movie gradually introduces us to the threat presented by Carroll O'Connor and his truck full of toilets. Rather than just have a random car come out of nowhere at the worst possible moment, here we see bad luck racing towards our hero long before we have any idea who he really is. On a personal note, this was my father's favorite film, and he introduced it to me when I was just a kid. I think he saw something of himself in Douglas's character, although on the surface, the 2 men couldn't be more different from each other. My dad was a Jewish hipster concert promoter who hung out with Neil Young and Alice Cooper. He wasn't an anachronistic cowboy, but the character's stubborn code of ethics and his distrust of rules and authority really struck a nerve in my dad, and while revisiting this movie for this episode, I felt that connection all over again. And finally, I can't help but wonder what this movie would be like paired with another film, Michael Douglas's thriller, Falling Down, which was released more than 30 years later. Both films tell the story of a man who's grown out of touch with the world around him and feels unbeholden to society's rules. In some ways, Falling Down is sort of like that dark reflection of Lonely Are the Brave, with the chaos of modern Los Angeles replacing the natural beauty of New Mexico. I feel like these 2 movies might be interesting to watch back to back.
I like this film a lot. I programmed this film last summer as part of a film series at the Briscoe Western Art Museum in San Antonio, where each of the films was a modern Western. So a film set in the contemporary American West, sort of from the 1950s to the present, that somehow engaged with the legacy of the myths that we've told ourselves about that most evocative of American spaces. This was Douglas's favorite film. He always said that this was the favorite of the films that he made, and he was the instigator behind it. He acquired the rights to Edward Abbey's novel, The Brave Cowboy. He got Dalton Trumbo to write the screenplay. So this is really his film through and through. The pairing with Falling Down, that's interesting, because I really like Falling Down a lot. It's one of my favorite Los Angeles films in some ways, and there are moments in Falling Down that speak to the transformation of Los Angeles. I think my favorite moment is when Douglas's character has the conversation with the little boy about where the subway is going to go in, and then he starts pretending that he's scouting for a movie and that they're going to add things in with special effects. I think that's an interesting juxtaposition. The thing about Lonely Are the Brave, though, I suppose, is its complexity or maybe ambiguity with respect to questions of progress. So in a film like Falling Down, there's a clear sense that the main character he's just been left behind. But in Lonely Are the Brave, there's a sense that Jack feels that way. But then when we kind of have that juxtaposed with Jerry, Paul's wife. To me, the most interesting moment in the film is near the start, when Jack goes to Jerry's house and he's lamenting the loss of freedom in the modern world with its borders and fences and no trespassing signs. And a very frustrated Jerry responds something to the effect of, I'm going to tell you something. The world that you live in doesn't exist. Maybe it never did. And that to me is very interesting. And it's also a remarkable statement to hear in a movie made in 1962 when the Western was at the height of its popularity. And to me, this film's kind of a litmus test in some ways for what you want to believe about the Old West, because most people that I encounter see the film as being very nostalgic for a way of life that was lost and displaced. But within the film itself, there's a suggestion that the Old West popularly understood, and that's the West that Jack and I guess many moviegoers in the audience watching him then and now long to return to, that West wasn't real, but was instead a fantasy. So I love that kind of complexity about the film, about the kind of the multiplicities that it contains, and the way that it acts as a kind of Rorschach test for individuals, that you can have people come out of the film. Most people, I think, come out thinking this is a lament for a lost way of life, but the film itself is suggesting that way of life never existed, and he's only bought into a fantasy of his own creation.
This is Kirk Douglas in an exceptional motion picture, Lonely Are the Brave. Life can never cage a man like Jack Burns. For him, everything was a challenge. Fences were to be cut, horses were to be tamed, a woman was to be loved. And life was to be lived fully in wild, lusty adventure. Co-starring Jenna Rollins.
You broke out of jail, didn't you?
Actually photographed atop the 10,000-foot-high Sandia Mountains of New Mexico.
We got him. He's right below us. I'll climb down and get him.
He stood alone, towering over all who would hunt him down. Kirk Douglas in Lonely Are the Brave.
My third film is Posse from 1975, about a U.S. Marshal with political ambitions who gets more than he bargained for when he and his super posse of deputies apprehend a notorious bank robber, train robber, and then decide to hold him for a few nights in a small Texas town while they and the townspeople celebrate. Douglas not only stars in the picture as Marshal Howard Nightingale, another great handle, he also produced and directed the film. Now, producing was nothing new for Douglas. Following a series of court decisions in the 1940s that loosened Hollywood's control over its stars and the film industry in general, Douglas had been among the first actors to form his own production company. Bryna Productions, named after Douglas's mother, made 24 films between 1955 and 1986, including The Indian Fighter, Last Train to Gun Hill, Paths of Glory, and, most famously, Spartacus. Douglas didn't direct a movie until 1973, however, when he made Scalawag, a disastrous retelling of Treasure Island. Scalawag captured little of the romance and adventure of the movies that Douglas loved as a child, but much of their staginess and histrionics. Now, remarkably, Posse, Douglas's second and final directorial effort, proved to be everything that Scalawag was not. It's a charming and stylish take on a venerable genre that capably balances reverence for the past with contemporary sensibility. For those who are inclined to look for it, Posse does what many celebrated Westerns of the past did, offer viewers a commentary on contemporary American politics. The calculating Nightingale, in the midst of a law and order campaign for the Senate, is a deliberately Nixonian figure who ends the film in disgrace. There's no question that Douglas, a lifelong liberal, intended this parallel. As it plays out in the movie, though, the political allegory is subtle. So subtle that I could imagine it being missed entirely, leaving us with a film that belongs to the long tradition of thoughtful Westerns that question the comparative morality of the hero and villain. In Posse, the clever outlaw Jack Straw, wonderfully played by Bruce Dern, outwits Nightingale, but this makes him effectively worse, not better, than the lawman. What I especially appreciate about Posse is the depiction of the frontier town, whose citizens emerge as the true heroes of the movie. it is incredibly refreshing to watch a Western in which society is not depicted as cowardly and corrupt, a trope that was innovative in the 1950s, but had, by the 1970s, worn exceedingly thin.
Yeah, this is really some kind of movie. This is took me a few viewings over the years to get on its wavelength. It's a challenging film, not necessarily one that I'd recommend to viewers who aren't already fairly familiar with the genre. I can see, even then, though, it not being everybody's cup of tea necessarily, but I really enjoy this movie for the reasons you mentioned. Its cynical humor is really great. It's not a particularly good-looking movie. The costumes and sets have a sort of hand-me-down quality to them, and the cinematography is a little washed out. There is a great moment, though, that reminded me right away of The Gunfighter. In that film when Peck threatens to shoot somebody from under the table as though he actually has a gun under there. I think I've seen that kind of thing before, where a gunfighter will often say, "I've got a gun under this table." And here Bruce Dern actually does have a gun under the table and shoots somebody right through the table several times. So that had me cheering. There's a lot of those little moments throughout this film that harken back in a way to the Euro Westerns of the time. Some of the violence, people being shot through the eyeball, and then you juxtapose it with some pitch black humor. So it's a really great movie.
Yeah, no, I think the connection with the European Western is well taken. This film did a lot better in Europe, actually, than it did in the United States. It kind of came and went. And one review I had read I thought was a good point that, it just wasn't that widely seen. And people who were interested in a Nixonian takedown in the mid-1970s were not watching Westerns. And people who were watching Westerns at that time were not interested in a Nixonian takedown. Although I still think that if you didn't have that background and context, it would be very easy to miss it. But oftentimes throughout history, there's something about the distance that comes from being in Europe that's enabled them to see the greatness in certain films that hasn't been perceived right away in the United States. Johnny Guitar would maybe be the classic example, but there are some other ones. And this is actually a similar film in certain respects, in that it takes familiar genre tropes and it maintains the familiarity, but there's a certain kind of darkness or ironical stance towards them that it can take a little while to get your head around. And I think you eventually realize that it's not making fun of the Western. It's just trying to do something genuinely innovative with it. So I like that a lot. As for how the film looks, it's certainly not as stagey as Scalawag was. Scalawag was shot by Jack Cardiff after he returned to cinematography from directing. And I think he hadn't shot a film since 1961, and that obviously shows. Posse was shot by Fred Konenkamp, who had won the Academy Award for cinematography for The Towering Inferno, but it also shot Patton and Papillon. So it's a much more contemporary film in terms of its camera movement and some of its editing. But to me, this of maybe all of the films seems the one that would be best positioned for a reappraisal and perhaps a celebration.
This man wants to be president of the United States.
But if I don't get him, I don't get elected.
This man is the most notorious outlaw in Texas. To get what they want, they use the Posse. 5 of the most ruthless killers ever trained in the name of the law. 2 men fight to control the one thing that will make him the most powerful man in the West. Posse may begin like most Westerns you have seen, but it ends like none of them. It will knock you off your horse.
My third Kirk Douglas Western is The Man from Snowy River. Released in 1982, it was written by John Dixon and Carl Cullen and directed by George Miller, not the George Miller who created the Mad Max franchise, FYI. Set in the mountains of Australia, it's based on a classic poem, and this is really a heartfelt coming-of-age story, or rather 2 coming-of-age stories, one his and one hers, about a headstrong young man named Jim Craig who goes to work for a wealthy cattle rancher and falls in love with his daughter. Kirk Douglas has a dual role here, playing both the rancher and his one-legged brother Spur. The film is part scenic Western, part old-fashioned family drama, and it feels influenced in a way by Carol Ballard's acclaimed adaptation of The Black Stallion, which was released 3 years earlier. Now, first and foremost, this is a Western in love with horses. It's a visual celebration of the grace and romanticism of the equine form, but it also captures the danger that horses represent as well. Director Miller generates a palpable tension each time the team of wild horses comes thundering across the landscape, and the main stallion leading them exhibits a spooky power every time it rears up on its back legs when the moon is high. Kirk Douglas was 66 years old when he made the film, and the dual role allows him to really have fun on screen. He doesn't actually share a scene with himself until fairly late in the film, but it's clear that he relishes the chance when it finally arrives. I especially love the way he plays Spur, complete with a rubber nose and a shaggy beard and an impressive peg leg. He's half Falstaff, half Long John Silver. This is a simple, familiar story, but it's well told with jaw-dropping scenery and gorgeous nature photography. It's a movie with a sincere appreciation for changing seasons and shifting weather patterns. And Miller's camera moves with a fluid ease, and the movie contains several stylized freeze frames and superimposed images that lend it a dreamy quality, which works quite well with the storybook plotline. The movie was a huge box office hit in Australia, and was a major success in the United States as well, so much so that when the sequel arrived a few years later, Return to Snowy River, it was released by Walt Disney Pictures. So if you could use a break from violent shootouts and brutal bar fights, or if you're hoping to maybe introduce your children to the Western genre, then this gentle tale of a boy and a girl and a whole bunch of horses is well worth considering.
This truly is a beautiful film. It's a very 1980s film, but in all the best ways possible. It sort of has the kind of the steel blue, as you said, dreamlike quality to the film. It has some truly beautiful scenes, including what is probably the most lyrical horsebreaking scene in the history of cinema. And that's saying something, because almost every other Western has a scene where you have to break a wild quote as a rite of passage. I suppose that one of us has to say that this is the film where Douglas finally meets his match on screen in himself. But I agree that it totally works, that the characters are different enough, and the payoff when we learn the backstory and the connection and their fallout is actually incredibly meaningful. The film also redeems Douglas's peg leg from Scalawag, proving that he could indeed pull that off. Now, I like this movie a lot, and there's a certain familiarity to it that is comforting, but the Australian setting brings enough novelty to it to make it work. It's a really excellent film, and I would second your recommendation that this is a great film to recommend to younger viewers, to introduce them to some of the best of the Western.
Yeah, I remember seeing it theatrically when it first came out, and I felt like at the time I was going to be too old for this movie. I remember thinking like the trailer looked a little too sappy or something, but I got dragged along to it, and I was just transported watching it. It worked on me perfectly, so I think this movie could still pay off for younger viewers. That peg leg really is pretty cool. I was pausing the video a few times.
How did they do it?
I don't know. It's not like a Forrest Gump maybe, where they could just CGI it out. It's really good. It reminds me of this Lon Chaney film, The Penalty, where he played a man with two missing legs, and he tied them up behind his back, and and he literally walks on the stumps, and he's a fabulous actor, of course. But I was looking at Kirk's leg here, trying to figure it out. It's a magic trick, and it works great.
Isn't there a Lon Chaney film? Isn't it The Unknown, where he plays someone without arms?
Yeah,
he played both an armless and a legless man in different films. He
has, definitely. Okay. He was the man of 1,000 faces. Of course, he's going to do that.
Well, I guess Douglas gets close to that with his masterful peg leg performance. Now, I agree. A great, just heartwarming picture that I think works for all audiences. It's the family film in the best sense of the word, where when you rewatch as an adult, there are some layers of complexity, particularly between the characters. You know, when you're an adult, looks between certain characters mean something that they don't when you're 10 years old. So this is a family film in the best sense of the term.
20th Century Fox proudly presents a magnificent epic adventure. A story of triumph.
Will you look at that?
A story of love. A story of a boy who becomes a man. The Man from Snowy River.
Well, that about wraps things up. I hope you've enjoyed our dip into the Westerns of Kirk Douglas. Until next time, folks, I'm Andrew Patrick Nelson.
And I'm Matthew Chernov, and you've been listening to How the West Was Cast.
Well, that was our show. We thank you kindly for listening and hope you'll come back again real soon. Till then, keep your saddle oiled and your guns greased. We'll be seeing you.